too round table. No, the table is not quite round.
It is quite round. So shall we start? Okay. Okay, apologies to, but if there is no injury, there's no need to apologize, right? So apologize for starting late this afternoon panel. Now, as you will notice for sure, the conference will take a bit of different path. If the first part of the conference was dedicated to legal argumentation, very much stricto sensu, now we're going to engage into more broad issues related to legal pluralism and normative transfer. That's something that Jen will be talking about. Maria is going to discuss the good of sovereignty and the sovereignty of good. And myself, I've envisaged my talk as something already theoretical debate applied to the European integration, and as such forming a bridge to the panel that is going to follow to the panel number 3. We shall proceed as our friends and colleagues did in the morning. Jen, you have around 15 or 20 minutes, and then we open up for the floor for debate. Just to introduce the two of you properly, Jane Henry, she graduated, she obtained her PhD from the European University Institute, as we all did, besides this panel. So it's a sort of an EUI panel, and it really feels great. It's a tiny little reunion. Jane's been working on the issues of legal culture, right, as applied within the context of European integration, but now, as she advised me, she's moved more into the field of legal sociology in comparative terms, and now she will be tackling the question of legal pluralism. Jane is otherwise now teaching. She's a lecturer at the University of Leeds. To say a word or two about Maria, she also defended her thesis at the European University Institute. We even had the same supervisor, so we are even more related. But Jen was also in a way supervised by Neil Walker. And Maria has been working on the question of constitutionalism and the issue of common good. And this is still reflected in your today's, at least in the title of your paper. Maria otherwise now works as a lecturer in constitutional law at the University College of Cork, Ireland. I think I've said enough, and now the floor, Jen, the floor is yours.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a great pleasure to be here in the morning. The weather, it doesn't look like this in Yorkshire right now, I can tell you that. So, yes, in terms of fitting the paper into the theme of the conference, mine is, I think, safe to say, far less concerned with natural law and more concerned with our postmodern times. So in terms of the paper, I've chosen to explore the idea of legal transfer, or rather normative movement, in terms of specifically legal and normative pluralism, and also within the broader kind of lens and frame of comparative legal theory. And the reasons for this are threefold, and they're really the ones that I outlined in the abstract. So, first of all, both legal transfer and legal pluralism have become increasingly prominent, I think, within the field of comparative legal theory, really over the last decade. And their prominence has really been as a result of developments in globalisation, Europeanisation, supranational and post-colonial processes. And I think that these two concepts are inextricably linked, and this is really as a result of their relevance to different legal orders and issues of contestation and interaction. And this specifically in terms of law and society, culture, and of course legal culture, which I'm not going to really focus on today. But they're rarely ever conceptualised with relation each to the other, so that's the focus specifically of the paper. And my reason for putting them together is that I think by framing one in terms of the other and vice versa, is that an alternative dimension is added to each concept, particularly in terms of legality and normativity, and that's really what I want to focus on at the outset. So, legal pluralism, I'm sure many people are aware of this here today, but legal pluralism, I would say, introduces the idea of spaces of normativity that may or may not be congruent with recognised boundaries of specific legal orders. And a fairly common argument here is that this promotes fragmentation of law within and across jurisdictions that are formally understood as monist or even monolithic. So it's an increasingly popular approach. It's been defined as Boventura de Sousa Santos as a key concept in the postmodern view of law, and it's been employed in a wide variety of endeavours. The literature is quite broad, but among others, the questioning of the character of law, challenges to the bias of the nation state as a sole legal source, and this sense of making sense, having insights into the connections and interactions that give rise to new and reimagined post-national constellations. So it's in terms really of these interactions that the idea of normative transfer really comes to the fore, I think. And just to be clear on this point, so transfer suggests the movement of legal norms between closed legal or normative orders, and this has really up until now concerned nation-state legal orders. And what I'd like to argue is that by framing legal transfer in terms of legal pluralism, another dimension is introduced to this debate, and this is namely the possibility of a reciprocal interaction of normative orders, and that this generates a new space. This in itself has the potential of giving rise to a newly contextualised form of a transferred legal norm that's detached from both of the original context. So this is the argument that I'd like to put forward. And I'm going to attempt this by focusing specifically on the kind of normative locus of state internal legal pluralism, so specifically state internal or intrastate legal pluralism, and this is vis-a-vis post-colonial societies with relation to indigenous communities. So I'm not really spending too long on the specifics of indigeneity. I just wanted to flag up that that's really where the paper is situated. So these intrastate or intrasystemic issues raised by the interaction of indigenous normative orders and institutionalised post-colonial state legal systems really concerns this idea of legal character and what counts as law. And as such, I think, despite the title, legal pluralism, the discussion is arguably more accurately phrased as one of normative pluralism, and I'll explain what I mean by this in relation to pluralism more generally. In pluralism, I think legal pluralism and normative pluralism, both of them are very useful concepts, but have almost been affected in their utility by the malleability inherent to the concept. So the potential and the scope offered by the conceptualization of plurality is really one that operates as a bit of a double-edged sword. The flexibility that it offers means that you can discuss pluralism from a number of different perspectives, but on the other hand, it seems to lack any real agreed upon defining contours, other than specifically being premised upon contestability, being premised upon this idea of conflict. So while not always necessarily spilling over or crossing over even into outright conflict, a plural constellation really only manifests if there are alternative paths or processes available within a predefined legal space. And this is in stark contrast to the monist situation, this monist or monolithic situation or a jurisdiction, as this really offers no potential for selection. This is the law you have, and this is how it's going to be. So writ large, I would say that legal pluralism specifically comes into being when there's a dispute, a disagreement, or some other form of contestation about the law that applies in a particular circumstance. And I think this popularity, this malleability of legal pluralism has led to its dilution, its conceptual dilution. It's become rather stretched and rather thin. And I think this has occurred in two particular ways, partly in terms of its character and also partly in terms of its application and its utilisation. So I want to just tease these out a little bit here. So in terms of the former, this character or object of legal pluralism, this really concerns the distinction that can be drawn between the legal and the normative. And so the engagement with the latter, the methodological or utilisation aspect, revolves around what I see as an ideological underpinning or an idea of emancipatory potential that's brought in by virtue of an instrumental approach. And I'll explain that in just a moment. But the first thing that I want to consider is the idea of this normative legal distinction, what kind of distinction this could be. And really to phrase this a different way, and to phrase this in a very probably familiar way, is to use the Sarah Engel-Merry quote about what requirements are social norms expected to meet in order to achieve the status of law within a particular jurisdiction. So as Merry says, where do we stop speaking of law and find ourselves simply describing social life? And she continues, is it ever useful to call these forms of ordering law? And I think if we're going back to Sarah and Merry, then we have to kind of go back to John Griffiths and John Griffiths' conceptions of legal pluralism. And I don't really want to spend too long on this because I don't really have a huge amount of time, but his idea of strong legal pluralism is quite simply that all self-regulation is law. So his understanding of law is that it's coexistent with regulation in the social, that anything that constitutes self-regulation is also de facto legal. And I think, while this is an intriguing point in terms of normativity, it's quite a drastic move, and it's a drastic move that serves to really undermine any claim to legality that could be asserted by an alternative normative order. So my argument here is that it empties out any legal claim. So strong legal pluralism in the Griffiths sense really is what I would conceptualise as being normative plurality. But this is really because within his conception, the law doesn't require any validation such as that would be required by the major proponents of a liberal legal theoretical enterprise. So nothing like a Coasinian group norm or a Hartian rule of recognition. And so by designating, I argue, by designating the legal as coexistent with regulation in the social, what Griffiths appears to do is signify a conceptual break between these legally monist theoretical approaches and those predicated upon a state-centred, a state consent-centred formalism. And by deprivileging the legal, what he does is he collapses this distinction between the legal and the normative. And I think it's in this broad conception of legal pluralism that has really given rise to this dilution, to this stretching that I mentioned earlier on. I also think that this is part of the reason that there has been part of the reason that there is such an ideologically motivated or instrumentalised approach, and I'll just explain what I mean by this right now. So my argument here is basically that instrumental approaches vary in the extent to which they facilitate the identification of emancipatory potential within the notion of plurality. And so implicit within the legal pluralist challenge to the state and to the state-centred formalist conception of a monist legal order is a claim to the counter-hegemonic. I would argue that this is quite a strong claim, but that it has to be recognised as an ideological motivation, that it has to be recognised as an instrumental approach. And by a claim to the counter-hegemonic, what I mean here is a claim to, or on behalf of, the minority, or the marginalised, the indigenous, the stranger, or the other. And this necessarily, and by association, involves the rejection of a Western, Westphalian, statist, liberal, authoritative, centralist, and monist conception of law and legal order. This is the flip side. And I would say that this challenge is an important one because what it has the effect of doing is not only tugging at the boundaries and the contours of the state, but attacking it at its very foundations, which is really to say this social contract type consensual basis upon which power, authority and legitimacy are all established. So this is my argument in terms of plurality and normative pluralism specifically, and so I just want to flip over into the second conception, the second concept, which is that of transfer specifically. And this involves an engagement with boundaries. Obviously, if we're talking about an intrastate or state internal situation of plurality, then there has to be a boundary separating out these alternative normative orders from that of the state. And so if it's to be posited that alternative normative spaces are in existence within the boundaries of the nation state, then these boundaries and borders have to be identified, and these boundaries and borders have to delimit the interior and exterior of those spaces. And I use the term space here in a fairly loose sense, so I don't mean to say that it correlates to a geographic or a territorial or jurisdictional locus, but rather a context or place that's constitutive of meaning. And that meaning is itself constituted by a boundary that separates normative space from its environment or from its surroundings. And I should say here that my background is in systems theory, so I tend to think about boundaries in rather systems theoretical terms. And at this point I would say that the establishment of a boundary is quite Lewinian in my conceptualization. So it's premised upon the drawing of a distinction, and that this assertion of alterity remains, to all intents and purposes, a neutral one until one side is selected or marked, whereby on this marking we are distinguished from them and they are distinguished from us. It's this marking of the different spaces on either side of the border that gives rise to the context and the meaning, and which is particularly important in a post-colonial situation. So in terms of the post-colonial situation, the colonial project, I just wanted to mention something very briefly about the original violence of the colonial project, because I think there's two ways that you can conceptualise this. And the first one is the standardised reading in terms of an omission, which is simply that there was a lack of participation by subaltern actors, indigenous actors, within the circumstances of the foundation. And so this would be this kind of disgraceful legal fiction of terra nullius, which is really can be reduced to nothing other than a land grab. I don't think it would be too difficult to say that that's pretty much accepted as fact. A different reading rather would be that the original violence was, in addition to this, the absorption of indigenous normative orders into that of a legally monist colonial state. And I think that this process itself is a twofold one. First of all, combining a misconception of indigenous norms as functionally equivalent to those of the state, and then an acontextual imposition of state norms upon practices and relationships that were ontologically distinct. And I think the important aspect here is the boundary, because it's when we focus on this idea of a boundary, that it's the borderline conditions, these margins where normative transfer occurs, if it occurs at all. And so this final point regarding transfer. Transfer is a slightly unwieldy term, and I don't have terribly long to
no, you have 3 minutes.
3 minutes, sorry. I don't have terribly long to argue in favour of it, but put very simply, I would say it's more nuanced than transplantation. Transplantation is unilateral, whereas transfer is bilateral or multilateral, and it's more dynamic than mere translation. I argue that transfer has the characteristics of a process, and really instead of just being reducible to mere movement, it denotes this reciprocal and interactive relationship that is, this is a core point of the argument, is that it's simultaneously both place and progression. So I bring the idea of translation into the idea of transfer, and I argue that it's the translating medium within the process of transfer that facilitates the conceptualisation of it as an interactive and reciprocal process. I also argue that this makes it, if anything, a far more ecumenical concept than it's been before. It's certainly recognised as being an ecumenical one, but far more than even before, because it liberates it from this pervasive binary of them and us and import, export, or similar. And so what I'm proposing here is really an interactive or translating space, discrete from both of the original context, distinct from both of the original contexts. This space could alternatively be phrased as autonomic, it could be phrased as it is in post-colonial literature, as an in-between space. And it is delimited by boundaries, but in this sense it's negatively delimited, so it's neither the marked nor the unmarked space, it's rather somewhere and something different. And it's the translating space that introduces this interactive aspect to normative transfer. So what I'm proposing here, and I'm just about to finish up Matty, don't panic, what I'm proposing here is that focusing not only on the outcomes of a process of transfer, but also on the circumstances is what is specifically important. I argue that focusing on the circumstances of transfer gives us an original insight. And so I think that recognition of this dual aspect process of transfer that is in essence created by a situation of plurality is far more important than anything else, and is particularly important within circumstances of normative plurality, and this specifically when there is a power differential asymmetry, and I will stop there.
Thanks, Jen. For this very well done presentation. And now I'm
19 minutes. That was minutes? 19, I make it.
Cheap. So, are there any questions? Welcome.
Oh, thanks. I really like your talk. Just two thoughts, and maybe you can comment or see if I get it right. When speaking about sort of a plurality, normative pluralism, I think that you meant more like this pluralism of systems or spaces of normativity, not pluralism within a normative system. And when you ended up with this picture of this transfer being a sort of a relationship interaction, the first notion that came to my mind from philosophy is dialogue, because you just described the basic presupposition of a dialogue. And maybe looking at the conditions for dialogue, will get you to the conditions that have to be fulfilled for there to be this genuine transfer, in the sense that you're looking for, like, I mean, the participants has to be recognized on the same level, and there must be genuine openness for the other, or an openness for the novelty. I mean, you can feel different peers will feel this out differently, but I think, do you see any substantial differences between the notion of transfer and the notion of dialogue in this sense?
And especially if I may add here one little footnote. How does this, I mean, he's inviting you, I might be wrong, but I think he's inviting you with this idea of dialogue quite far away from your underlying premise of a systems theory. Because systems theory, if I'm not wrong, is all about, autopoietics, systems closure, and sort of, if there is communication, is miscommunication. So, if I may answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, I probably didn't make this particularly clear. I always use systems theory as a little bit of a disclaimer for anything weird that might be a result of it. But the paper isn't a systems theoretical paper, it's just that I recognise in my own conceptualisation of a boundary or a borderline that it's very, very similar to Luhmann's construction of a systemic boundary. So I'm not trying to apply systems theory, I'm just actually flagging up what I think is a very clear Luhmannian copying situation.
But with different consequences, right?
Certainly with very different consequences. I think in terms of dialogue, there's certainly a similarity in terms of the interaction, and it's the interaction I think is the most important. The difficulty with dialogue is that it assumes, I think, and I'm not particularly familiar with the term, but I think it assumes a certain level of standing, and also, as you mentioned, it assumes a recognition. And in these sort of power asymmetry situations, the recognition isn't always there. And at the same time, there is, which is perhaps feeding into your point, there is perhaps a more nuanced point regarding communication and miscommunication. So in terms of talking about the same things, so I think there's oftentimes a danger of drifting into you're talking about property, we're talking about property, and the assumption that it's the same thing. And I know that in terms of specifically the Australian situation, the big point in terms of the Mabel case, which had its 10th anniversary this year, incidentally, Mabel case, it's like the state conception of property is not the same as the indigenous, the Aboriginal conception of property. So in a way, the dialogue is perhaps conditioned by those things. But I think, yes, there's certainly a similarity, and it's something that I will definitely look into. In terms of recognition, which is the other thing you mentioned, there's a lot of work being done on this idea of a recognition space. And I think the recognition space has always been one that perhaps fits more into Griffiths' idea of weak legal pluralism, which is something that I didn't actually cover in the paper, well, I covered in the paper but didn't cover in the presentation. And that it tends to remain, this recognition tends to be top down, it tends to be the gift of the state. And that recognition in a way, despite the fact that it facilitates a dialogue or an interaction, does tend to colour it slightly. So, but I'll certainly look into dialogue.
Okay, Marco?
Yeah, just a short question. So, do you see any role for comparative law as a 100 years old legal discipline in overcoming this misunderstanding but still respecting different cultural perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I use a lot of the insights of comparative law. I mean, it's always tricky when you present snapshots from a paper, right? So I use a lot of comparative legal theory in the paper, specifically the engagement with legal transplants and translation, and constructive misunderstanding, and that is more substantial within the paper, but Matteo only gave me 19 minutes. But yes, comparative law is very important, and I think particularly in terms of some of the insights provided by comparative law and comparative legal studies in relation to the European Union. A lot of the insights there are stealable to you can take them from the EU context and apply them to more globalised or supranational or state internal processes. I think it's a very fertile area for pillage.
I can see no other questions, but I will ask something else, if I may. You made some really interesting remarks, such as receiving or perceiving claims to legal pluralism, or the very emergence of legal pluralism as an ideological movement, you said, right? In post-colonial or colonial post-colonial terms, as an emancipatory movement. In statist terms, as fighting this hegemonic status of the state. But then you also said something. You also said something else. You said that it was this broad conception of legal pluralism that, I agree with you, right? That opened up the entire debate and inflamed it even further. But I'm wondering to what because what you could be understood in a sense as saying that it was this broad conceptualizing that opened up the debate.
Yeah.
But I'm questioning, wasn't first the change in the factual circumstances, the sociological change first, which actually spurred the development of this conceptual stuff in legal pluralist terms, and in deconceptualizing and collapsing the very idea of positive status law. And if this is so, then what legal pluralism is telling us, that something we took for granted, the concept of law, it actually only rests on certain premises